Hi, and thanks for joining the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. My name is Raphael Fazel. I am an assistant professor in public law at the University of Cambridge and the co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. Some of you may be here for the first time attending one of our talks. I'm just going to say a few words about how the talk series works. We will start with a presentation by our speaker that will last somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes, and we'll then segue to a Q&A/discussion where everyone is warmly invited to come in with comments or questions. If you would like to make a comment or ask a question, please use the raise hand function, which you can find under the React button on your Zoom app. That way you get to ask your question directly to our speaker. It makes for a really nice discussion usually. If, however, you're on the train somewhere or you can't speak, you don't have a mic that's working, you can also pop a comment or question in the chat. I could just go through the chat as well and then feed those comments to our speaker. Until we reach the Q&A, I will have all the mics on mute. We are recording this talk, and you can find a video version later on YouTube and our website if you'd like to share it with a friend. Okay, with this out of the way, it is now my great pleasure to introduce our amazing speaker today, and that's Dr. Susana Monsó. Susana Monsó is Associate Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Logic, History and Philosophy of Science at the National Distance Education University in Spain. Her work focuses on the socio-cognitive capacities of animals and what ethical implications those capacities have. She's published in a range of renowned journals like Philosophical Quarterly, the British Journal of Philosophy of Science, and Kentnis. Her recent book, Playing Possum, How Animals Understand Death, which was published last year by Princeton University Press, has been recommended in the New York Times and The Guardian and was selected as one of the best books of 2024 by The New Yorker. So we're really thrilled to have her here and tell us a bit more about her exciting book. So I'm handing over to you, Susana. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much, Raphael, for inviting me and for this lovely introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming to hear me talk about this. I have to begin this presentation with a trigger warning that I've been told off for not having on other occasions. So let me just warn you that this presentation will be discussing some gruesome topics, and it will include some pictures of animal corpses, including some pictures of primate infants that some people might find disturbing. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm going to be talking about the question of whether animals understand death. Now, this question, the research that I'm going to be presenting is research that I began before the pandemic, and that I originally published in these two articles that you can see here, and it was later condensed in this book, Playing Possum, How Animals Understand Death, which was originally published in Spanish and was revised and updated for its publication with Princeton University Press in October 2024. Okay, so the way I've organized this talk is I've divided the talk into sections that correspond to the different chapters of the book. I think this is a nice way of introducing these topics because each chapter begins with the story of an animal. That's sort of an excuse to develop the themes of the chapter. So I think it makes for sort of an animated presentation. I hope you will enjoy it. Okay, so let's begin with the first chapter, which is called The Ant Who Attended Her Own Funeral. Now, this title refers to a behavior that we see in ants and other eusocial insects that's called necrophoresis. So what does necrophoresis consist of? This is the behavior by which ants dispose of corpses that are inside the colony. They pick up the corpses and they take it out of the nest. They take them out of the nest into the refuse pile, which is outside of the colony. Now, this capacity presupposes a capacity to distinguish, to discriminate live ants from dead ants, right? But we are pretty sure that ants don't have a concept of death. Even though they can discriminate live from dead individuals, conspecifics, they don't really understand what death means. Why do we know this? Because this behavior is a very rigid, automatic reaction to certain chemical components given off by corpses, such as oleic acid. Now, if you take a drop of oleic acid and you put it on a little leaf or a pebble or even a live ant, the other ants are going to treat it as though it were an ant corpse, and they're going to pick it up and take it out into the refuse pile. And they can't make the inference from the fact that the ant is moving about to the conclusion that she's not actually dead. And this shows us that they're not really operating with a concept of death, but rather offering a pre-programmed reaction to a certain sensory stimulus. So this behavior allows me to distinguish two broad categories of reactions to death that we can find in the animal kingdom. On the one hand, we've got what we can call stereotypical or stereotyped reactions to death. These are reactions that are innate, so the animal is born with them. They're rigid, so they're carried out in a very sort of stable pattern. They're automatic, so the animal can't help but carry them out. They're also linked to concrete stimuli, so they're triggered by concrete stimuli in the environment. So in a way that's very sort of determined, so that if you have the same individual and the same stimulus, you're always going to have the same reaction. But also if you have different individuals within the species, they're also going to have the same reaction. So it's very homogeneous across individuals and within individuals. And these reactions are clearly adaptive. So the reason why they're pre-programmed is because they offer clear evolutionary advantages. In the case of necrophoresis, there's a clear advantage in that corpses are sources of pathogens, so it's very advantageous to take the corpses out of the colony and into the refuse pile, because this protects the colony from infection. So that's one category of reactions to death. And then we've got a separate category, which is what I call cognitive reactions to death. These are behaviors that are learned, so the animal is not born with them, but rather it's the result of her life experiences. They're flexible, so they can be carried out in different ways. They're under cognitive control. They're not linked to concrete stimuli, so different stimuli can give rise to the same reaction, and different reactions can be caused by the same stimulus. And within an individual's lifetime, she can have different reactions to the same stimulus, and different individuals can have different reactions. So there's a lot of variability. And these reactions are not necessarily adaptive. They are not pre-programmed. They're the result of the animal's life experiences, and there might not be any evolutionary reason for the animal to have them, and they might even be maladaptive in some cases. So here's an example of an animal species showing cognitive reactions to death. What you see here is a series of pictures of a group of chimpanzees reacting to the corpse of an adolescent male of the group. You can see the corpse in some of the pictures, like here and here. So what the researchers saw in this when they came across these animals was a wide variation of reactions to the corpse. So some animals sat around the corpse quietly observing it. Others were inspecting it. They were touching it or sniffing it. Some reacted aggressively, engaging in dominance displays or even attacking the corpse. And then there was a very interesting reaction by this older female who was very close with the deceased. And when the group had left, she stayed behind with her daughter, and she grabbed a little grass stem and began to clean the teeth of the corpse. Now, I'm not saying that these animals necessarily understood what was going on, but certainly the high variability that we see here shows us that there were cognitive mechanisms at play. So the animals were reacting differently depending on their personalities, their state of mind, their beliefs, their desires, their relationships to the deceased, and so on. Now, it is cognitive reactions are to death are going to be my focus for the remainder of this talk, because it is here where we could possibly find a concept of death. Okay, it's not necessarily going to be the case that animals that show cognitive reactions to death have a concept of death, but it's here where we might find it. And what I'm going to try to convince you of today is that these chimpanzees likely understood what was going on with their mate, and that we don't even have to go to animals as cognitively sophisticated as chimpanzees to find a concept of death in nature. Okay, so the next chapter is called The Whale Who Carried Her Baby Across Half the World. This refers to the story of the orca Taliqua. Now, Taliqua became famous in the summer of 2018 when she was seen carrying the corpse of her newborn calf who had died shortly after birth. And she was carrying this corpse for 17 days and over 1,000 miles. She was actually tragically again in the news rather recently because she gave birth to another calf who died, and she was also seen carrying out the same behavior for several days. I actually don't know if they've seen her stopping it or what actually happened in the end. So back in 2018, where she first was seen carrying out this behavior, she appeared in news outlets all over the world. People went absolutely crazy, and they began to discuss this behavior on social media. They wrote poems about it. There were all these discussions, and everyone was very moved by Taliqua's story because they seemed to see in her a mother who was grieving. It seemed to be a very understandable reaction to the death of her calf. Now, some researchers, however, called for caution. They said, we have to be careful here because even though it might look like this is grief, we might be actually misinterpreting Taliqua's behavior. We might actually be carrying out or engaging in anthropomorphism. Now, this is a very serious problem for comparative thanatology. What's comparative thanatology? This is the study of animals' reactions to death. This is a very recent discipline. It's only about 15 years old or so. And because of its subject matter, because it studies animals' reactions to death, it's very opportunistic and anecdotal in character, because it's very difficult to study these behaviors in the lab, and we obviously cannot go around, killing animals in the wild to see how others will react. So there's a limit to how much control we can have over the evidence, right? Most of the evidence in comparative thanatology consists of field reports that are very anecdotal in character. So there's a group of biologists who are in the field, they're studying a species, and they happen to come across the reactions of a group of animals to the death of another individual, like the case of the chimpanzees that we saw before, or the case of Taliqua. And this raises the worry that comparative thanatology might be especially prone to anthropomorphism because it's very difficult to carry out experimental studies, and because there's very little control over the factors that might be influencing the animal's behaviors. The researchers might be more likely to fall prey to anthropomorphism. So what is anthropomorphism? In strict etymological terms, it's the attribution of human characteristics to some non-human entity. But within comparative psychology, it's used in a more normative sense to refer to the erroneous attribution of a typically human characteristic to an animal. So it's assumed that if you're engaging in anthropomorphism, you are engaging in a false description of reality. Now, I think anthropomorphism is a real threat here, and we definitely have to be careful not to fall prey to it. However, there are also other biases that have received way less attention and that we should also be avoiding. One of them is what Andrews and Huss call anthropectomy. Anthropectomy is the other side of the coin to anthropomorphism. So if anthropomorphism is the erroneous attribution of a typical human characteristic to an animal, anthropectomy would be the erroneous denial of a typical human characteristic to an animal. So if we say that Taliqua is grieving when she's not, we would be anthropomorphizing her. But if we say that Taliqua cannot be grieving because she's not a human when she is, then we would be anthropectomizing Taliqua. And what Andrews and Huss say is that both anthropectomy and anthropomorphism are errors to the same extent. They're both false description of reality, and so there's no reason to fear one over the other, but rather we should be very careful not to over-attribute, but also not to under-attribute. The other bias that we should be wary of is anthropocentrism. This consists of taking the human experience as the gold standard and the lens through which all animal behavior ought to be interpreted. Now, what I'm going to argue in the rest of the talk is that comparative thanatology has been and continues to be guilty of anthropocentrism in two different ways. On the one hand, there is an intellectual form of anthropocentrism, which consists of assuming that the only way of understanding death is the human way. So animals either have our concept of death or nothing at all. And the other form of anthropocentrism that is at play here is what I call emotional anthropocentrism, which is the idea that the only emotional reactions to death that are worthy of our attention are human-like reactions. So in the next two chapters, the next two sections, I'm going to be discussing first intellectual anthropocentrism and then emotional anthropocentrism. So moving on. The following chapter is called The Chimpanzee Who Played House with Corpses. This makes reference to the story of Lucy. Lucy is a chimpanzee who lives in the wild and who has been seen carrying out a very surprising behavior. So one day, the researchers saw that she was carrying around the corpse of a bush baby. Now, bush babies, which are a type of monkey, are usually considered a very precious food item by chimpanzees. They love to eat them. But Lucy didn't seem interested in eating the bush baby. Instead, she seemed to be play parenting it. She was carrying it around using the same techniques that chimpanzees use with infants. She was grooming it, sleeping next to it, and so on. And interestingly, she also did this with the corpse of the baby of another chimpanzee from the group. She stole this corpse and also play parented it for a while. What is interesting about this case is that Lucy appears to be sterile. She doesn't have any known descendants and appears to have some unfulfilled desire to be a mother, which seems to move her to engage in these peculiar behaviors. Now, irrespective of the reason why Lucy was doing this, there is an immediate question that pops up, which is, did Lucy realize that these babies were dead? Now, in order to answer this question, of course, as a philosopher, I must always begin by saying, well, it depends on what you mean by understanding death. Now, philosophers, as well as comparative thanatologists, have been guilty of what I call intellectual anthropocentrism, which is the assumption that understanding death is a very intellectually demanding feat, one that they have linked to very demanding cognitive capacities, very sophisticated capacities, such as a theory of mind or the ability to attribute mental states to others, a concept of life, a concept of absence, a concept of time, analogical reasoning, and abstract thought. These are all capacities that have been explicitly linked to understanding death in the literature, and that they have been used to deny a concept of death to animals. Because they don't have these capacities, they can't have a concept of death. Now, this results in a concept of death that's very, very complex and very, very intellectually demanding. And this contrasts a little bit with how we understand the concept of death when we think about human development. So usually we don't think that human animals, human children, develop a concept of death overnight, but rather study shows that it takes them about 10 years to develop a concept of death. But before they are 10, they already have some understanding of death. Even though it's not very sophisticated, they have some understanding. I like to give the example of playing Super Mario Brothers with a 6-year-old and how they get something about what it means when their character dies, right? So when we're thinking about human children, we seem to admit a gradation here. We seem to think of the concept of death as a spectrum, something that you can have to a bigger or lesser extent. However, when we think about the case of animals, we set the standard somewhere over here around the average adult human, and we say either animals have a concept of death equivalent to the average adult humans, or they have nothing at all. Now, this, of course, sets a double standard, one for children and one for animals. That doesn't seem very fair to begin with. But also, I think it turns the question of whether animals can understand death into something that's just not very interesting. If the question of whether animals can understand death is equivalent to the question of whether they have a concept of death that's as complex as that of adult humans, with all the narratives that we have surrounding death, or all our symbolic representations of it, etc., then the answer is going to be no. And it would have made for a very short book. It would make for a very short talk, and it just wouldn't be a very interesting way of thinking about it, I think. The more interesting question, in my opinion, is whether animals can have anything that counts as a concept of death. So in order to answer that question, instead of beginning from the hyper-complex concept of death of the average adult human, we need to begin from what I call the minimal concept of death, which is the bare minimum that an animal needs to understand in order to be credited with a minimal concept of death, with some concept of death, sorry. So let's start from there, and then let's see how complex animals' concept of death can actually be. But let's not start from the hyper-complex one, because that's just gonna yield very uninteresting results. So in order to determine what the minimal concept of death looks like, I begin with the 7 subcomponents of the concept of death that developmental psychologists have used to determine the extent to which human children understand death. Now, these are the following: non-functionality, which is the idea that dead individuals cannot come back to life; irreversibility, non-functionality is the idea that dead individuals lack the typical functions of live individuals. Irreversibility is the idea that they cannot come back to life. Universality is the idea that all living beings and only living beings die. Then personal mortality is the idea that I myself will also die. Inevitability is the idea that there's nothing we can do to postpone death forever. Causality is the idea that death is caused by a breakdown in the bodily functions. And then unpredictability is the idea that we cannot predict the exact timing of death in advance. Now, it takes human children, as I said, about 10 years to develop a concept of death with these 7 subcomponents, but I'm interested in which of these are actually essential to death. Which of these would constitute a minimal concept of death? Now, I do not have time to carry out the analysis here, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But basically, the result of my analysis is the minimal concept of death is just made up of two subcomponents. These are non-functionality, the idea in rough terms that that individuals don't do things, and the idea of irreversibility, the idea that you cannot come back to life once you're dead. So with this in mind, I define the minimal concept of death in more technical terms as follows. A creature can be credited with a minimal concept of death once she classifies some dead individuals as dead with some reliability, where dead is understood as a property that pertains to beings who A, are expected to have the cluster of functions characteristic of living beings, but B, lack the cluster of functions characteristic of living beings, and C, cannot recover the cluster of functions characteristic of living beings. Now, there are several things in this definition that have to do with what possessing a concept entails. I'm not going to go into that, but I do want to bring your attention to condition A, because condition B and condition C refer to non-functionality and irreversibility. But there's also an extra condition that I bring in here that's not discussed by developmental psychologists, but I think is very important, which is the idea that death is something that only applies to individuals who can be alive, right? Because a rock is irreversibly non-functional, but it's not dead because it's not the sort of thing that we expect to be alive. So if you're going to have a concept of death, you need to have some expectations about the living functions characteristic of beings of a certain kind. And these are the functions that if you can understand death, you understand that they are lacking and that they cannot be recovered. Okay, so that's how I propose to tackle intellectual anthropocentrism. Now let's move on to emotional anthropocentrism. The next section is called The Dog Who Mistook His Human for a Snack. So this refers to the story of an anonymous dog that I call Firulais. And Firulais, well, his owner, his caretaker, committed suicide. And when the body was found 15 minutes later, the body was missing a big chunk of its face that was sitting in Firulais' stomach. Now, Firulais still had food in his bowl, and as I said, only 15 minutes had passed since the death and the moment the body was found. So, what was going on here? Now, this phenomenon of dogs who feed on their dead caregivers is surprisingly common. Now, I've given this talk in front of many audiences, and people are always very shocked. They react with nervous laughter. Maybe if they have a dog, they're thinking about them in a different light now. So what is going on here? Does this mean that our dogs don't love us? Because, as I said, it's a very common phenomenon, and in a very large number of cases, it occurs in the first 24 hours after the death and with the dog having access to other sources of food. So it's not that the dog is starving, it's that the dog chooses to eat their caregiver. Now, does this mean that dogs don't love us? I don't think it means that. In fact, we have a lot of scientific evidence that dogs actually do love us, that they care about us very much. So what could be happening instead? I think a clue comes from the form that this behavior takes. Now, dogs, we tend to think of them as companion animals, but around 80% of dogs actually live on the streets or in the wild with no human companion. And they are hunters, but they are also scavengers. And when they scavenge on a corpse, what they tend to eat is the abdomen, because that's where the nutrient-rich organs are. But when they feed on their caregiver, what they tend to focus on is the face. In 75% of cases, the caregiver shows bites to the face. And this, I think, gives us a clue as to the motivation of the animal. Why? Because our faces are our communicative center. They are the thing that best depicts our emotions, and they're the part of our bodies that dogs pay the most attention to when they interact with us. So what is likely going on in these cases is that once the owner is dead, the dog is trying to get a reaction from the face. And when they can't get a reaction, they get frustrated. And how do dogs calm themselves down when they get frustrated? They use their mouths. They start licking things or nibbling on things, and probably what they start licking and nibbling on is the owner's face, which is right in front of them. Why not? And at some point they draw blood, and then that's when one thing leads to another. But at the root of this behavior might precisely be the dog's love for their owner and their anguish at their absence of response. So I think this is a very interesting case. I don't bring this up just to traumatize you, but because there's something very surprising, which is that this is not a behavior that's considered of interest for comparative thanatology. I've never seen any comparative thanatology paper mention this behavior, even though it is an animal reaction to death and a pretty interesting one at that. Instead, it's just reported in forensic journals. It's not really mentioned by the thanatologist. So why is this? I think that the reason behind this has to do with emotional anthropocentrism. So emotional anthropocentrism is the idea that the only reactions to death that are worthy of our attention are those that resemble human-like reactions. So this, for instance, is one of the pictures that triggered the birth of comparative thanatology, where a group of chimpanzees is looking very intently at a corpse of a deceased group mate, and the picture is entitled "The Grieving Chimps." Now, in one of the papers that gave birth to comparative thanatology, the authors, James Sanderson and company, they describe the reactions of a group of chimpanzees to the death of a loved one, and they establish some analogies with human behaviors, and they write, these behaviors highlight the interest of a comparative evolutionary perspective on death and dying in species without symbolic representations of death or death-related rituals. We propose that chimpanzees' awareness of death has been underestimated. Although data are likely to accumulate slowly, a thanatology of Pan appears both viable and valuable. So what they're saying here is that the reactions of Pan species, so chimpanzees and bonobos, are not their reactions to death are not interesting in themselves. Rather, they become interesting the moment in which we can show that they are human-like. So what has this entailed? This has given rise to an extreme focus on the paradigmatic human reaction to death, which is grief. An immense amount of papers have been devoted to discussing grief in animals. So for instance, this is a case of a little gorilla who lost his mother, and you can see him here sitting on the corpse, and he was grooming it, he was stroking it, even attempting to suckle from her breast, even though he had been weaned some time ago. So this is what appears to be an example of animal grief. Another example that's often discussed is deceased infant carrying. We saw similar cases in the case of Taliqua and Lucy. These are a macaque and several different chimpanzees carrying the corpses of their infants for prolonged periods of time that can go up to months. There was a recent case in a zoo in Valencia where a chimpanzee held on to the corpse of her infant for 7 months. So this appears to be, again, a manifestation of grief. Now, I think that animal grief is a very serious issue that definitely deserves our attention. However, if we are concerned with the question of whether animals can understand death, grief cannot be our only focus. Why is this? Firstly, because grief can happen in the absence of a concept of death. There are many stories, for instance, in Barbara King's great book, How Animals Grieve. She has many stories of animals reacting to the death of loved ones when they might not know or understand that they had actually died. So, for instance, cases of companion animals who have their friend taken away for euthanasia and they never see them again, but they're very distressed at their absence. We can talk about grief, it seems, in this case, but there's probably not a concept of death operating there. At the same time, grief can lead an animal with a concept of death to treat the dead as though they were alive. This is because grief is not really about understanding death. Grief is about dealing with the death of a loved one. What grief signals is the presence of a strong emotional bond that has been broken in some way. And this might lead the animal to want to pretend that the dead one is alive for a little while, like these mothers who hold on to their babies and groom them and care for them. This is actually a behavior that's recommended as therapy for women who have a stillbirth, to take care of their baby's corpse for some period of time, a couple of days or something, because this alleviates their grief. Now, more importantly, the reason why we should not be focusing on grief is because a concept of death is compatible with a myriad of emotional reactions. So if someone dies, you can grieve them if you have a very strong emotional bond with them, but you might also feel joy if you're going to inherit a large sum of money, or you might be excited if you are very hungry. Maybe you are stuck in the Andes with no other food and someone has just died and maybe you're eating tonight. Or you might be fearful if it signals the presence of some danger in the environment, or you might be confused if you don't quite understand what happened, or you might be totally indifferent because you just don't care about that individual. All these emotional reactions, even though they're politically incorrect and we wouldn't admit to having them in public, they are compatible, perfectly compatible with understanding that a death has occurred. So we need to look beyond grief. Now, the following chapter is called The Elephant Who Collected Ivory. And elephants are the animal that most immediately springs to mind when we think about animals in death. And in fact, they do seem to be very interested in corpses of conspecifics, and they show very, very interesting reactions to them. And indeed, I think they are very good candidates for a concept of death. And this has to do with the fact that they have a very high presence of three causal factors that I think are absolutely necessary for a concept of death to emerge. So what are these causal factors? The first of these is cognition. You need the animal to, in order to have a concept of death, you need to be able to grasp a concept of death. So you need to have a certain level of cognitive complexity that elephants, for instance, surely have. At the same time, you need a certain presence of certain emotions, because emotions are what modulates our attention. And we need animals to pay attention to a corpse in order for a concept of death to be developed. And so we need a certain emotion to be at play here. And we see this, for instance, in elephant, in that they form very, very strong social bonds that give rise to emotions when there's a death in the group. And lastly, we need experience, because I'm assuming that animals are not born with a concept of death, but rather that they need to have experiences with it in order to learn about it. And elephants, as you know, are very long-lived, and in the wild, there's a very high infant mortality rate, and so they're going to have many experiences with death. But I think, and what I argue in my book, is that we don't need to go to animals that are that cognitively sophisticated as elephants to find a concept of death in nature, because it's actually pretty easy to find the requisite levels of the three causal factors. So with regards to cognition, It's actually very common for animals to have expectations about the living functions of individuals around them in order to be able to distinguish biological from non-biological movement, for instance, because biological movement is much more important to monitor. And they need to be able to distinguish anomalous behaviors, because anomalous behaviors in others always represents either threats or opportunities, so they're very important to monitor. But animals who can monitor anomalous behaviors will likely also be capable of monitoring the absence of behaviors, especially given that dead individuals don't just stay still. They actually, like, their non-functionality is multimodal. They stop moving, but they also smell very different, sound very different, feel very different. And in addition, death comes with its own functionality. So dead individuals don't just stop doing the things that living individuals do. They also start doing new things, things that dead individuals do. They start smelling a certain way, decomposing, getting covered in flies and maggots, etc. And these signs can help an animal to understand that once these signs appear, the process cannot be reversed. At the same time, many emotions can give the animal the incentive to pay attention to corpses in her environment. So an animal might pay attention to a corpse because she's sad or anguished at their lack of response, or maybe because they're excited because that individual ranked higher than them in the hierarchy, and it's actually good that they're not moving right now, or they might be disgusted by the corpse, but in a way that's kind of interesting and they can't stop looking at it. Or they might be frustrated by their lack of response, angry, aggressive, or they might be fearful of this new stimulus in the environment. All of these emotions can provide the right motivation, and many others surely as well, for the animal to pay attention to the corpse and learn about it. And lastly, animals in the wild are going to have many, many, many experiences with death because of the high prevalence of many lethal factors such as predation, natural disasters, interspecific fights, human-related causes, parasitism, disease, etc., etc. So it's actually going to be quite easy for animals to have these minimal levels of the three causal factors. Now, the final chapter, and this is what I'm going to end with, is called "The Opossum was both dead and alive," which makes reference to the title of the book, Playing Possum. So what does this refer to? This refers to the behavior of the Virginia opossum. This is a marsupial that lives in the American continent and is very famous because when she feels threatened, she plays dead. But she plays dead in a way that's very spectacular. She doesn't just stop moving, rather she adopts the bodily and facial expression of a corpse. Her mouth opens, her tongue hangs out and adopts this bluish hue. Her bodily functions are reduced, her breathing rate and heart rate drop, her body temperature drops. Her glands simulate the smell of rot, and she stops responding to the world completely. Now, the Virginia opossum gives title to my book because I think it's one of the best pieces of evidence that we have for the prevalence of a concept of death in nature. And I'm going to explain why this is so. But first, we need to take a little detour to consider the role that violence plays in the emergence of a concept of death. Now, as I said, because of this emotional anthropocentrism, comparative thanatologists are focused on reactions to death that are very loving and caring, that exemplify grief. But that's not the only interaction that animals are going to have with death in nature. In fact, many, if not most of the interactions that animals are going to have with death in nature have to do with violence. This is because there is a high prevalence of phenomena that I'm not going to discuss here right now because I don't have time, but things like infanticide and coalitional attacks. These are pretty common phenomena, but there is especially one behavior that is all over the place, and that has, I think, a lot to do with the concept of death, which is predation. I think that predators, which are pretty much completely neglected in comparative thanatology, are actually excellent candidates for concept of death. And I'm thinking specifically of large predators. Why are they such good candidates? Because they seem to fulfill they seem to have a high presence of these three causal factors that I mentioned. So first of all, there is a very high emotion involved in the hunt. The hunt is usually exciting for these animals. It's something that brings them pleasure, which is something that's very common. Those things that are usually the most important for our survival are the things that we tend to enjoy the most. And so it's normal that evolution has given them an enjoyment in the hunt. But also, there's a very big emotional incentive to pay attention to the specific moment in which the prey dies, because prey that is alive represents a danger. Prey animals are very often armed with sharp horns, hooves, claws. They're very often very temperamental. If you've ever tried to pet a squirrel, you will know this. And so they are dangerous, and it's actually not uncommon for a predator to die at the hands of a prey animal. However, once they die, they become food that cannot escape and cannot attack them back. So there's a big incentive to pay attention to that specific moment. At the same time, predators have a very high presence of the experience factor, because especially if they're carnivores, they're going to have daily opportunities to learn about death. And if they live long enough, this can amount to thousands of opportunities. At the same time, they tend to be cognitively complex animals who have specifically a tendency to monitor the functionality of prey. This is because they tend to target those animals who are an easier catch, because they deviate from average functionality, because they're either too young or too old, or they're disabled or injured or sick or whatever. And so they already have a tendency to monitor when animals are showing an anomalous functionality, that's going to prime them to determine when they don't show any of their typical functions. That is when they're dead. And so, how does this relate to the opossum? Well, predator cognition has often acted as selection pressure and given shape to the behaviors of prey animals, and behaviors or the appearance of prey animals. So for instance, there are insects that have the shape of sticks or leaves, and they likely don't know that they look like a stick or a leaf, and then they don't need to know this, because the reason why this is advantageous is not because they know that they look like a stick, but because their predator confuses them for a stick. That's why this behavior is advantageous. And so it's the predator's cognition that has driven the evolution of this appearance, because the more they look like a stick, the less likely the predator is going to eat them. The same is the case for cases like Batesian mimicry. So here you can see at the top insects that are toxic, wasps and bees, and below you have flies that are non-toxic, but they mimic the appearance of toxic species. And this mimicry tells us something again about the minds of the predators. It tells us that these predators can associate a certain appearance with toxicity, and that's why it's advantageous to have this appearance. Now, some animals take advantage of the tendency that predators have to monitor the functionality of prey. So, for instance, some species of bird pretend that they have a broken wing, and this is something that they do to attract the attention of the predator and lure her away from the nest. By pretending they have a broken wing, they postulate themselves as an easy catch, and so attract the attention of the predator. But the reason this works is because the predator understands that this is not how birds usually behave. This bird, clearly there's something wrong with him, and it's going to be easier to catch him. So This brings us lastly to thanatosis. Now, thanatosis is the technical term for death feigning, which is the behavior that we see in the opossum, but we also see in other animals. For instance, some species of frog lie belly up with their limbs extended and flaccid, their mouths open, tongues hanging out, and expelling this ammonia-like smell from their breath. Some species of snake lie belly up with mouth open, tongue hanging out, secreting blood from their mouth and displaying no signs of breathing. And they sometimes even precede their death display with a display of dying. So they pretend that they're dying by writhing erratically and violently and then playing dead. Now, I think that these animals likely don't understand that they're playing dead. This is likely an automatic reaction, the same way that our pupils dilate and our hair stands on end when we are fearful. However, I think it is a very important piece of the puzzle that I'm trying to build here, because the very existence of these displays tells us something about the minds of the predators that they're trying to deceive. So the minds of these predators is what has acted as selection pressure and given shape to these displays, because the more convincing that the predator herself finds it, the less likely she is to eat this animal. And so the more likely it is for this animal to live long enough to reproduce and pass on her genes. And this is how this behavior has become more and more complex throughout evolutionary history. And so what this behavior shows us is how these predators understand death. They understand that dead individuals look a certain way, that they smell a certain way, that they stop responding to the world, that they are cold, etc., and all the components that we see here. And it's because these are all heterogeneous components that don't really have any reason to hang together as part of the same behavior, except for the fact that they're signs of death. And so that's why they work as a deceit. At the same time, because this behavior has emerged in different in species that are quite apart in the tree of life, it seems to have emerged through convergent evolution, which points to the presence of similar selection pressures in different habitats, which suggests again that the concept of death is not a uniquely human feat, but rather is probably going to be very widespread in the animal kingdom. And with that, I end. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.